want to wish everyone a good day from wherever you're connecting from, campus or beyond. My name is Professor Audrey Sawyer. I am a professor in Earth Sciences at Ohio State University and also an affiliate of the Sustainability Institute, who is the sponsor for this new series called the Front Porch series. And it's my great honor to be able to share with you as the first event in this series, a conversation with Professor John Cherry, winner of the Stockholm Water Prize, about groundwater, a critical water resource. And so I just want to welcome you all to this first conversation and especially welcome those who are doing the Passport to Earth Day program. Thank you for participating in that program to celebrate Earth Day. And as we get started, what I'll do is I'll begin by introducing the problem of groundwater and why it's an important resource in just a brief amount of time. And that will really set the stage for me to be able to introduce today's expert, Dr. John Cherry. And then we'll have a conversation, an informal conversation about some of the greatest challenges facing the world when it comes to water management, in particular groundwater today. And I would encourage people as we go to just put any questions you have in the Q&A feature of our chat, and we'll be sure to introduce some of those questions so we can hopefully try to answer your pressing questions by the end of this 1 hour event. So let me begin by setting the stage here. Groundwater is sometimes a little bit overlooked for us here in Ohio, where we have Lake Erie and the Great Lakes right in our backyard. But about half of humanity drinks groundwater, and Ohio is actually not much different. About 42% of our population relies on groundwater as its source of water. And about 70% of our global food that comes from irrigation ultimately relies on groundwater in some way. And much of that is being depleted in a way that is unsustainable. Nearly all aquifers are contaminated to some degree, as John Cherry has shared with us through his research on groundwater contamination. But we are still trying to do the hard work of figuring out the health effects of that contamination. So just a brief introduction. Groundwater is underfoot. It's often not seen and overlooked, but most of all liquid fresh water available to us on this planet is from groundwater. Groundwater is really what's there to sustain us as a planet when it comes to liquid fresh water. And we are exhausting that water to put food on our tables. A perfect example from the United States, one that I study in many of my classes with students, is the High Plains Aquifer, which stretches over large parts of the U.S. plains from the northern part of Texas all the way up to South Dakota. This aquifer supports 1/6 of our global grain production, and that supports our beef industry in the United States too. But much of that water is being mined unsustainably. It's water that was recharged these aquifers over a very, very long time period, and we're now pulling it out over very short human time scales. And we are in the process of driving those groundwater levels down until the groundwater is gone. And that also affects how streams flow in places like Kansas, as shown in these maps here. These are all the streams that flowed year-round in Kansas in 1961 versus 30 years later as we have lowered our water levels and groundwater in our aquifers. And we are on a time frame that looks like we will deplete large parts of this aquifer within our lifetimes. And that means that we won't be able to grow corn in this region because corn needs irrigation, and irrigation in this region needs groundwater. This is not just happening in the high plains of the United States, it's happening worldwide in many of our food growing regions and our bread baskets around the globe. It's not just water quantity that we worry about, it's also water quality. And there have been a few places in the world that haven't been touched by some of the modern chemicals that have come on the scene in our lifetimes. One of the sort of classic poster children of modern contamination is the family of chemicals known as PFAS, known as forever chemicals because they don't break down very easily in the environment. They're found in some of our food packaging, our water repellent fabrics, our nonstick products, our cleaning products, and our firefighting foams. And so far, we find them pretty much everywhere we look in soil, groundwater, and rivers around the country and around the world. And this is really not just a global story, this is our story here in Ohio, because one of the compounds, PFOA, has been found in extremely high concentrations right in the Ohio River Valley. It's the story covered in Dark Waters and the story covered by Robert Billot in Exposure. And to give you an idea of just how bad the contamination is in our backyards, some of the concentrations detected range from 1,000 to 10,000 nanograms per liter, whereas the new standard that our federal government has put in place for our drinking water is 4 nanograms per liter. So some of the levels in our waterways in Ohio are 1,000 times the level that we've considered to be safe in our drinking water. But I want to just emphasize that the global water quality issues are even more acute, and not just for these synthetic organic compounds, but in particular for pathogens that cause waterborne disease and cause diarrhea. This is one of the leading reasons that children die worldwide, and there are still large parts of the global population that don't have access to clean water. Groundwater is an essential part of the solution for overcoming waterborne disease issues because groundwater, for the most part, is already kind of naturally filtered by the Earth's rocks and sediments, and so it tends to be much lower in pathogens than surface water. Water and groundwater in particular also play into issues with energy. John Cherry has said there is no environmentally friendly form of energy, but one of the more environmentally responsible forms of energy turns out to be nuclear. And in fact, the UN has designated nuclear energy as a green form of energy. And in the United States and also in Ohio in particular, we really haven't pushed nuclear energy production to the level that we're capable of based on our capacity here in Ohio in particular. And those reasons are not so much environmental as political, but they have big effects on how our water is used and how it flows because water and energy are intricately connected. I could go on forever, but I want to introduce our speaker, and in particular, his project, the Groundwater Project, where you can learn much more about these groundwater issues. The Groundwater Project is a fantastic project that John Cherry has been leading to really democratize access to understanding water in the world, producing publications on water and groundwater in particular in different languages for different levels of audiences, from children and children's books all the way up to academic researchers. So this is what John Cherry has been doing to help us understand the groundwater challenges we face as a society. What can you do? I just want to encourage you all to take some of the great classes that Ohio State University offers that are really multidisciplinary and designed to get at some of the challenges we're facing in society now, not just related to water, but related to energy and food production. And if you're interested, develop an expertise in groundwater. These are just some of the earth science classes you can take, but you can find many more outside of earth sciences through climbing onto the Sustainability Institute website. And with that brief introduction, I want to go ahead and give a formal introduction to John Cherry. Our speaker today is an expert in groundwater. He is a hydrogeologist who has authored one of the most definitive books on groundwater in the world, Groundwater by Friesen Cherry. And he is the winner of the Stockholm Water Prize. and was also awarded the Lee Kuan Yew Water Prize in Singapore. He is a distinguished emeritus professor at the University of Waterloo, and he has been leading the Groundwater Project to really expand our understanding and access to information on groundwater on a worldwide basis. And we are just so honored to have you here with us today, John. Thank you.
My pleasure to be here. I always welcome the opportunity to talk about groundwater with students. And I think it's a topic that can give people an avenue to do some good and to be hopeful.
Well, thank you for sharing that hope with us today. I want to start by asking you, globally, you've documented that groundwater resources are in decline, and it's a huge problem for food security and for famine because most of our crops come from groundwater. So why do you think we're in this situation? Do decision makers not realize the situation we're in with depleting our aquifers? And if they do, why is it so hard for us to reverse our course?
Well, of course, that's the key question, and very few decision makers understand anything about groundwater. So the laws and regulations and the enforcements and all that don't quite get done as they should. But even you mentioned the High Plains Aquifer, which is one of the most unfortunate depletions going on in the world. Everybody knows what's happening. The water levels are going down each year. But the way the laws are set up and the way the routes of agriculture is set up, the farmers own their land and they kind of own the groundwater, maybe not legally, but in usage. And that's their world, and they're going to pump it till it's dry. And in fact, there's no interventions that are on the scene to correct that. So those farmers will produce as much food as they can for the world, and that part of the world will survive economically. And when the water's gone, it'll go back to being a desert. All those green circles that you saw won't be there, and the land will support very, very few people. So it's all part of sort of the global unsustainability we're on. And groundwater is the key to water resilience. I mean, when drought comes, then groundwater is the only water you've got. So in many parts of the world, it's just lack of understanding. But in parts of the world where there is a big understanding, unless you've got water to divert. So the Chinese were doing what was happening there in the US, and then they built a $1 zillion transfer scheme to bring water from the south to the north. And that'll keep them going for a while, but most countries don't have that water to divert. And we Canadians, I mean, in a way, we're always concerned, as you are in Ohio, about water from the Great Lakes being diverted to solve the Arkansas and Texas water problems.
Yeah. We, I think we do get these ideas in our head that we will be able to solve our water issues with big diversion projects. And I know parts of Arizona have been thinking about, desalinizing water from the Gulf of California and bringing it up to Arizona and then sending the waste back. How are these big water projects potentially a path forward?
Well, not that I'm an expert on that, but they don't seem to be because first of all, it would take so much money and it would take so much time. So the crisis really is over the next few decades. In general, we're led to believe that climate, in particular CO2, is the big deal. But in terms of humanity surviving the next few decades, it's food and water. And of course, water is connected to ecology, like it's connected to everything. And one of the reasons I think for students, choosing to go into water and groundwater is in fact there's lots of room to actually get engaged and do some good. There's a deficiency of knowledge, yeah, deficiency of young people to use that knowledge.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and I was going to bring this up later, but maybe we should just go ahead and jump into it now. What do you think the job space looks like out there for students who are interested in solving water issues? What's the future right now, and what can they be doing to prepare for the most in-demand careers in this space?
Well, that's really interesting. As I travel around the world, what I found in some countries is that some of the developing countries is that the students aren't getting jobs because there's so little awareness of the need for groundwater expertise. In Canada and the US, there's a decreasing availability of graduates with the right training. Like there's lots of students graduating in environmental science and things like that, but water and particularly groundwater requires a very specific education if you're going to actually be involved in problem solving. So in Canada, as far as I know, in the US, if you have the credentials, you'll immediately get a job, likely wherever you want to live. That's the amazing thing about hydrogeology and groundwater. In a way, you can kind of choose where you want to live.
Fantastic. And where, this is another interesting direction to go with the conversation. Where would you want to live right now if you wanted to be in a place where you could solve important water related issues, but also be in a place that had a sustainable future ahead of itself, maybe where there aren't as many concerns about water scarcity and water security right now?
Wow. I've traveled to many countries in the last few years, and I don't kind of look at it that most people are, almost all people are actually happy to live where they're living. You develop a relationship to the people and the land. And then the problems are all a little bit different. The politics are different, and climate is different, and water is different. I mean, some of the small countries in Europe are kind of highly organized, politically, and can do more to function, to protect themselves. So that's I think, and I traveled in China and India and whatnot, and so it's amazing how humanity is surviving, uh, and in many cases quite well. It's just that we have these dark clouds on the horizon, and of course, what we're all facing is the problem of how do you equip yourself and how do you get engaged to do some good.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess related to, I don't know, the dark clouds on the horizon, you've done a lot of speaking publicly about issues with running out of water in the future in many of our food growing regions and whether or not we're heading towards the bottom and running out of water to really support our food. Do you think we'll be able to reverse the course? You already mentioned the fact that a lot of times farmers are making day-to-day decisions where they need to pump the water out of the ground and it gets extracted without much ability to coordinate a long-term sustainability plan. Do you have much hope for our ability to reverse course in the future?
Of course, there's two big problems with food and agriculture. One is using too much water, and the other is using too many chemicals. So food production has to change. That's what all the people who study the state of the planet say. People who study regenerative agriculture, and there are books on it, but they all indicate that if we as a society actually wanted to change to sustainable agriculture, it would support global population. So the results from sustainable agriculture and all sorts of forms of it, greenhouses and all sorts of forms of it. But apparently, the science shows that if we as a society want to change and a change in the way we produce our energy and whatnot, and in fact, technology offers a way out. So it would be hopeless if, in fact, we looked at the numbers and concluded, well, there is no way out. And like the world population is 8 billion. It's going to go to 9 billion. That's what everybody tells us. And it's going to go to 9 billion very quickly. So by 2050, apparently it's going to be another billion. So the crisis period is coming as we add a billion people, and then the global population is going to go down. And then we've got, half the world is in either water poverty or energy poverty or both. So those people need more energy and they need more water. Um, so it's really a political decision-making um, a problem. And that's why it's so important for young people to get educated on the problem. So, for example, the news media completely misrepresents almost everything, including nuclear power. Without nuclear power expanded in a very major way, it's not going to be possible to get to sustainability. The solar and wind isn't sustainable because every 20 to 25 years you have to replace all the solar panels. And the wind turbines, you have to replace them every 15 to 20 years. And I took my solar panels down from my cottage, and what am I going to do? Well, I'm told to take them to the dump and buy some new panels. So it's very important that we get informed of the actual numbers and then try and individually operate the best we can. I might also mention that you indicated that 99% of all water is groundwater, and that means we have to think that whenever you see a lake or a river or a pond or a wetland, that water is most of the time is mostly all groundwater. So we have to get away from thinking about surface water as the key. Groundwater is the key that keeps all those things functioning. So groundwater keeps the ecological systems functioning. Um, and it's the key to almost waste disposal. So nuclear waste can be disposed of perfectly safely. The groundwater communities worked on that for 40 years. The decisions on where to produce the waste, in concept, you put the waste down in a deep mine that's 500 meters, and other countries are doing that. So it's a matter of I think all of us becoming informed so we can push governments and our politicians to take advantage of this wonderful technology that we have to solve many of these problems. I mean, I'm an optimist, probably a genetic optimist, but in this day and age of so many difficulties, but there's good reason for optimism if we can line ourselves up to do the right things.
Yeah, yeah. So speaking of the role of governments in making a lot of these decisions that affect our water, the role of government and science is a really big topic in the US these days. And you bring a perspective coming to us from Canada, but having traveled the world. What do you think some countries are doing or not well or well, better or worse to manage their water resources? And I don't know if you could tell either the Canadian administration or the US administration one thing that you would want them to hear to help ensure safe access to water for future generations, what would it be?
Well, water is a key to so much. So we have to understand water. There's hardly anywhere around the world where we monitor water well, particularly groundwater. So we can talk about aquifers being depleted and running dry, but when you actually ask, well, how fast and how long? So groundwater is an area of lack of information. Um, so we need, and then when politicians want to cut budgets, the last time we cut budgets in Canada, we cut out much of our national groundwater monitoring because it just doesn't seem to be so valuable in the short haul. So basically, understanding our water, monitoring our water, and making the monitoring public and everybody engaged in it. For example, every school could have a little well. You find out where's the water table. Students can measure it. So groundwater, which is 99% of all water, is still mysterious, and yet the resiliency of the planet depends on it. So the problem with pumping too much and polluting too much is we're losing our resiliency. Well, now in Canada, we have a very weak federal government, so our Department of the Environment is not like EPA or anything, or the USG is. So we have basically 10 countries. So when you ask, what do we do in Canada? Well, the answer is, well, we have 10 different provinces and each do it differently. Some do a few things well, but mostly not. So Canada is kind of a, oh, and then we Canadians, we waste water, we learn in school, we've got more water per capita than any country in the world. And we really don't care about water unless you Americans want to use water from the Great Lakes. That's the only time we care. And it's politically it's humorous, but unfortunate.
Yes, I mean it's the perfect example though of a transboundary water relationship that we're working with our neighbors to the north. So I'm glad you mentioned that one.
Well, so if I could comment, for example, those, we're all trying to be environmentalists of one type of another, and it's perceived that buying an electric car could be environmentally positive. Well, like, so, for everybody to have an electric car, we're going to have to mine 10 times as much. Mining is about digging. Mining is about using water. It's about using water. It's about polluting water. So I've never seen a full system analysis of the environmental impact of electric car. Now, in China, where they have so many electric cars, their air pollution is getting much better. So obviously, you can see the benefits. And I think if they did the calculations, they include that the benefits are worth the cost. But I'm not sure that that's the case, anywhere else. So we have to think that in everything we buy and use and consume, water is in it. And if water is in it, then groundwater obviously is largely part of it.
Let's actually talk about the trends in water quality because we have had this industrial revolution where we're doing so much to manufacture, whether it's an electric vehicle or something maybe less environmentally friendly. The industries that we work with these days have real consequences for water quality, as do many other things like growing food and putting fertilizers on farm fields. What what is your outlook on water quality? Is it getting worse? Are some things getting better? What are your concerns at this current time, looking forward to future generations and their water quality?
Yeah, so all surface water, is polluted to some degree or not. So you wouldn't drink surface water unless it's highly treated. So like half the people in the US and in the world drink groundwater. And the impression's always been that groundwater is safer than surface water, and that's true. But there's hardly any surface water that's being consumed for drinking that isn't, shall we say, young water. So when you age date almost all the water we're drinking in Canada and US and Europe, it's all has age dates that are younger than 50 or 60 years. And then that means then that almost all water, if you analyze it down to a low level, has things that you don't like. Pesticides, PFAS, nitrate, pharmaceuticals, you name it. It's amazing what people find in well water and spring water when you actually analyze it down to the last part per trillion. Now, the health authorities are really in a difficult situation because, cities tell the population that the water's safe to drink, and increasingly there are more compounds in it. Each compound is at a low level, which is safe in its own right. But of course, the big fear is when you add hundreds and hundreds of compounds that are human produced compounds of the type that the human body has never seen before. Well, what's the effect of all of that? So one thing that we have to do is we have to start analyzing our water in much more detail. And all the people who are rural in small towns, they're neglected totally. I mean, the water that's being consumed out there by Canadian and American people living in rural areas is just plain dangerous when you sample a bunch of wells. If you're a private well owner, then you're on your own. If you're in a small town, you don't likely, have access to high-priced labs. So the World Bank recently wrote a report saying, yeah, we're worried about, water quantity, but at the end of the day, this creeping water quality problem is coming up on it. And then that leads us back to agriculture. It leads us back to food, and it leads us back to our individual choices.
Yeah.
And so I like blueberries, for example, and blueberries grow in Canada for a month and in the US for a few months. But when you go into a grocery store, you can buy your blueberries anytime. And when you look at them, they're most of the time now they're from Mexico or Peru or from South Africa. And studies have shown that most of these blueberries that people like me buy, not only are they grown with irrigation water that's unsustainable, but they get to us by airplane.
Yeah.
So we're all involved in this crisis, and I guess the challenge is to be informed. individual.
This, I'm glad you mentioned this because this gets me every time when I go to the grocery store. Most of the produce is coming from someplace in the world that's actually not very water rich, whether it's California or Chile.
Yeah.
It's surprising. Can you tell us a little bit about that kind of, it's called virtual water, that exporting basically of goods that have been produced with local groundwater resources or water resources?
So the British professor who discovered the term virtual water, 20 years ago, he realized that when we're shipping food around the world, there's water in the food, the blueberries, etc. So he named it virtual water, and then a team of Dutch engineers quantified it. So when we go into our grocery store, everything you buy that's from outside of your country is coming from somebody else's water, and much of this food then comes from countries that have less regulations, less environmental protection. So we who can afford to buy that food, in essence, are helping the world become unsustainable through our lack of knowledge. Now, economists tell us when all this virtual water, all this globalization got going, the economists will say, "Well, that's great because that provides global food security because if you have water from many, many places, but in fact, the reverse is happening. It's providing insecurity as aquifers dry up that aren't being monitored. So Saudi Arabia, for example, they've passed peak water. They pump so much groundwater that they're way past their peak. So how can Saudi Arabia, as just as a country, they've got 35 million people now from 5 million, for 50 years ago. They can only exist because they've got oil money to buy food from somewhere else, to buy water and food from somewhere else. And in many cases, the water and the food they're buying is unsustainable.
Let's drill into that a little more, no pun intended, because we've received one question from the audience related to this pressure to look for new water resources. So much of our groundwater has issues with salinity, and contamination, or just the water resources are not enough. There's now questions about whether we can look offshore for finding freshwater reserves in subsea aquifers below the seafloor offshore. Can you comment a little bit on your thoughts about whether we should explore these resources to offset our current increasing demand, or whether we should be looking for more efficient ways to use the groundwater right under our feet on land? And I do want to emphasize this is a question from
Yes.
the audience. Thank you. Please keep sending your questions.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question because the scientific literature now has a number of papers where scientists are discovering offshore, off Hong Kong and other places, they're discovering fresh water. But but we shouldn't look to that at all as a resource to help us out. It's likely not going to last very long. There's too much salinity. So, I mean, the only way we can think about fresh water is we have to use it better. All those green dots that you saw on the map then they come from irrigation spigots. Okay, and it's a very inefficient way of using water. Israel, it basically uses water, it's 100 times more efficient than the rest of us. So we have to solve our problem as human beings by adjusting our diet to some degree, by putting a great emphasis on the use of water effectively. Now, there are countries like Singapore where, in fact, they treat all their sewage, so all their sewage goes back into the drinking water system. They desalinize ocean water, so it's a little country of 5.5 million people sitting there on an island, and they have to do that, and they're very proud of that. But the problem with that is that it takes a lot of energy to do that. So Singapore can only be sustainable on water, doing all that when they have energy, and now they're committed to being net zero by 2050. So they're not going to be able to, they can't have it both ways. So we humans have to adjust our living so that we're very conscious of water and use it very carefully. And then most studies show that amazingly good things can happen.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned energy too. I do want to tackle a little bit of the demands on water when we pursue different energy policies and dive in a little bit more to some of your thoughts on energy sources like nuclear. Can you unpack for us a little bit why nuclear is sort of like the redheaded stepchild of energy in the US, and why it should be potentially thought of differently when you view the science on sort of clean energy and water for energy.
So I became aware of nuclear energy when I was in high school in Ottawa, and the physics teacher had a master's degree, which is rare at that time, and he spent his summers when he wasn't teaching helping with the development of the Canadian nuclear power system. He would go out to our miniature version of Oak Ridge. So he was a very much a nuclear supporter as a physicist, and he told us that nuclear energy is going to basically save humanity. And then 20 years later, after I got my PhD, I just stumbled upon opportunities to study radioactive waste. So I got to know the Canadian nuclear industry. I got to know about waste. I traveled a lot, and in that little period in my time, I was an expert. And I was in the late 60s and 70s, and that's when the United States was building its nuclear power plants very successfully. You have more operating nuclear power plants than any country in the world. We in Canada built nuclear power plants in the province of Ontario. We're 60% nuclear. And then all that, and so then the American building of power plants ended, and it ended because, in fact, the way it was going is nuclear power was going to be so successful, it was going to affect the price of coal and oil. And it's a tragic tale here because then the Sierra Club in California and later on Greenpeace discovered that there was a great way to raise money by convincing people that nuclear would be unsafe, and there were politics involved. So the whole anti-nuclear, let's scare everybody thing got going, and it's put stop nuclear in its tracks. So if in the US you'd continued to build nuclear plants for another decade or two, you wouldn't have any of the CO2 stuff that you're worrying about now. If we people in Ontario had gone from 60% nuclear to 80% nuclear, all we had to do was build a few more plants. We wouldn't be even worrying about this carbon stuff. Now, China came to the game late, of course. They began to develop nuclear power in the 80s. And next year, they're going to have more power plants operating than the US. And their commitment to getting at net zero is based on becoming 25% nuclear. And so back in the 60s and 70s, the nuclear experts they told us, okay, the plants we're building now, like back in the 60s and 70s, they're called a third generation plant. They were safe enough, they were good enough, they've been safer than any other type of power. But then the next type of plants were going to be totally safe. So the Chinese are now building thorium nuclear reactors, an American idea, which in fact doesn't use water. It doesn't produce much waste, and the waste can be reused. They can build them in the deserts far enough away from people. So nuclear got sidetracked by the so-called environmental movement. So what's the message there is that we citizens have to learn how to think so that any time that any lobby group tries to sell us some bad idea, we have to be able to unpack it. And so groups like the Sierra Club at that time, but particularly Greenpeace, much of their fundraising was based on being anti-nuclear. Very unfortunate.
Yeah, it is a shame that the politics sometimes get in the way of making data-based decisions.
Oh, if I
Speak.
could, if I could say further, okay, nuclear waste. Is there reason to be afraid of it? Yes, it's highly radioactive, but it's not a high volume. It's easy to manage, and all you have to do is dig a deep mine, like 500 meters or 1,500 feet, and find the right geology and put it in there in a very safe way. Finland has its mine operating, and Sweden's getting one going, and the Chinese are building one, and we Canadians will have one soon, maybe politically. So, in fact, we decided that we will fear nuclear waste, but nobody decided to fear organic chemicals.
Yeah.
Like nobody decided to basically fear all these exotic type of chemical compounds that we humans use that the human body has never seen before. So, we know the effects of radioactivity, but we don't know the effects of PFAS. So students in studying environmental science, I mean, there's so much opportunity for young people to become aware and become engaged and try and help society get on the right track.
I want to talk a little bit more about this job issue too, because you mentioned the potential for environmental scientists to work on, say, the health impacts and the environmental impacts of some of these chemicals in the environment. But it seems right now, at least under the new administration, some of those jobs might be under the chopping block. We also have a question in the chat, a couple of audience members who are interested about career paths and groundwater in particular, but they have concerns that a lot of the current paths for people learning about groundwater are in areas of mining or high-tech industrial development. I think there's this question about, will I really be able to do good? Will there be paying jobs in areas that do good if I go into these fields? What do you see as the very specific job opportunities for a student graduating either with a focus in groundwater or in environmental science from a US institution right now?
Yeah, no, young people want to get an education where they can graduate and work on the right side of sustainability. And in that sense, if you get a degree, specialized in hydrogeology, you're going to work for a government agency, but those jobs are few and far between. But you're likely going to be working for a consulting firm. And consulting firms that's where you get to study all these things, whether it's a waste dump or whether it's a mine or whatnot. But but there's a great opportunity for well-educated people who have the right outlook to work anywhere, because in fact we need people with the right outlook working for the mining companies and all these things. And in general, the mining companies in all the other countries, they want to be on the right side of sustainability. But if you can't hire employees that know enough and can speak to it well enough, then the system doesn't work. And the regulatory agencies, you're in a downturn in the US here and whatnot and so forth, but that'll come back. So in general, when it comes to groundwater, we don't have enough well-educated people in any of the agencies or in any of the companies. Now, it's hypocritical to say that we're not going to work for something to do with mining, because there's nothing you do in your day that doesn't use something that's mined. Now, my daughter went into hydrogeology, and I didn't press her and whatnot and so forth. But she went into it because she saw that in my world, when she saw us get together, colleagues coming for dinner, we were so excited and interesting to talk about groundwater. So she got a chemical engineering degree and then decided what she wanted to do. And she said, "Well, I'm going to groundwater because, Dad, you and your colleagues, you have such interesting discussions. As groundwater is puzzle solving, it's problem solving, and no matter who you work for, it's a puzzle. How much water can you pump? Is it too polluted? And you can be engaged in problem solving." So I got four grandkids, and I've been so concerned about young people not going into hydrogeology. I've been pressing it pretty hard. Now I know that's not the thing you're supposed to do, but I'm a grandfather. A parent can't do that. And 2 weeks ago, one of my grandkids who just went to university said, "Grandpa, you needn't bug me anymore. I've agreed to go into hydrogeology." I agree, I won't bug you anymore. And that's how convinced I am that there's opportunity to learn how to solve problems and work to solve problems. So
I,
being an environmentalist, it can take different paths, but to be sustainable, we need people who can problem solve and bring their ideas to the table, and a lobby in whatever organization or in lobby for the right path.
I love that the optimism of your response. And I'm also really glad you mentioned environmental consulting as an important area where you can work on all kinds of environmental issues for good, to try to understand where the contamination is or how much water can be pumped for a more sustainable planet. And one of the things that I've heard environmental consultants in Ohio talking about recently is planning for the water needs for data centers and really understanding what kinds of pressures might be placed on our aquifers and our streams in Ohio as we start to support more data centers or chip manufacturing. All of these things are water intensive. Is that something that you've thought a lot about? And if so, what do you think the future is there in terms of
Yeah.
balancing those needs?
So I just realized recently, a few months ago, of the water needs for these data centers. And I was in Singapore a couple of months ago reading the newspaper in Malaysia, the Malaysian government, where they're developing a big chip center and data centers and whatnot. So the industries that want to promote that in Malaysia ask the government for a certain percentage of their fresh water. The government's, oh, no way. And the numbers were so huge. And so basically water's in everything, and fresh water is limiting, and it's now even limiting when we get to trips and what chips and whatnot. And it just means then that water and groundwater then has to be understood and it's got to be managed. So it's all about becoming educated, becoming numerate. And I get so excited and I'm so happy with my grandson went into hydrogeology because, it's an opportunity to participate in problem solving that's really important. But you got to learn some stuff, not just talk about it.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm also glad that you mentioned students getting out and measuring depth to water in wells as part of their classes. I teach hydrogeology at Ohio State, and we do go out and we look at wells. So if students are interested in doing more of looking down wells and trying to understand what's in the subsurface with limited data, there are options here
Yeah.
at Ohio State. I also have a question in the chat about who is doing the best forecasting these days of future water needs. What does the landscape look like right now for really forecasting not just water availability, but also water use and water needs?
Well, I can't say that I can speak to that very well, but in my travels, what I'm most disappointed with is the lack of government monitoring of water of all kinds, but particularly groundwater. So for example, um, there are those that say that we've reached peak water, we've reached peak fresh water, and there are those that say that we're now reaching peak oil and all that. But um, so okay, reaching peak water. Well, where would we learn about that? Well, you go on the web and you go to Our World in Data, and you'll see a graph. It's a graph of water consumption over the past 70 years. And it rises and rises and rises. And the last data is in 2014, and it's kind of reached a peak. And I noticed this a year or two ago, and I used that slide, and I looked it up the other day, and still the latest data is 2014. And the people who put that together have a little paragraph. And they say, well, this is the latest data, but it seems like we reached the peak. Um, but the issue here is not whether or not we actually reached the peak. We don't even know enough about our water use to know if we reached the peak or not. And when I traveled in France recently, and I asked the agency that would be the most knowledgeable in France, the French Geological Survey, and I said, this number for France, that's your peak use. Where did it come from? And the woman in charge of the department that would give that number said, well, I don't know. Nobody asked me. And then I asked the same question in China recently, and actually found the woman who puts it on the table for China, their water use. And I said, "Oh, how good's the numbers?" She said, "Oh, well, the numbers, it's a huge error because the numbers come from the local county, blah, blah, blah." So fresh water is so undervalued and it's so under monitored that we as a society don't know how much we're using. Now, the US is in better shape than most. Um, but my important point is that so the surface water and all that stuff, the number's probably pretty good. But for groundwater, like how would a country ever know all the wells that are pumping? Like all these irrigation wells, and then part of that water goes back in the ground. So we humans are at a state where water is increasingly critical, and we don't even know how much we're using. And so what's the easiest water to get? The easiest water to get is to drill a well. So there are many illegal wells around the world. And in California, like every time California has a little drought, then all the drillers from the US converge in California and drill a whole bunch of new wells. And well, that's against government policy, but what are the farmers going to do? So that's all part of the sort of the lack of knowledge. And it's always a low priority. So groundwater is a low priority for governments, and all of us need to try and fight that.
And yet it's so essential and important. And I just want to give a shout out. You've just mentioned three different governments. The US Geological Survey is are the keepers of our water data. The French equivalent of the Geological Survey and Chinese government. These are all
Yes.
the agencies that are really the only ones who know at all what's going on under the surface, under the land surface with our water resources. And in this time where I don't know, political views towards supporting government science are shifting. Can you just give like a little pitch for why this is more important than ever before?
So it's really tragic what's happening in the US. Like the US Geological Survey was a gem of an organization. They hired excellent people. They've got offices in most of the states. They have national programs. And the beauty in the US is that all their data is public. Now, our data in Canada is public, but it's hard to get, and the government agencies don't feel a high obligation to make it public. So the first thing is to have data totally public and available. And the US GS has done an amazing job of that. So if we don't believe in government, and if we don't believe in having government employees, then we're not believing that we can have modern data to make decisions on. Now, there's always the statement that government is inefficient. Well, yeah, okay, there's lots of inefficiency in the world, but the one thing that those of us interested in the environment have to push for is environmental monitoring.
That's right.
So, if, for example, back a decade, decades ago, if I wanted to know the state of the planet, I would look for a book published by Jeremy Brown, I think his name was, and he ran the Earth Resources Institute in Washington D.C. And he was an agriculture economist. But every few years, he'd produce a book on the state of the planet. Okay, now there's nowhere you can go to read about the state of the planet. Environment Canada used to produce a report, but they stopped doing it 30 years ago, probably because it was too embarrassing. So we humans have our advanced, form of in the prosperous countries, we pride ourselves on our form of government and of democracy. Yet, if you're interested in the state of your country environmentally, you cannot find it in a document that explains it.
Oh, I have another question related to this, if I can shift to an audience question. How do we educate the next generation, the public, and politicians in our current world of information bubbles, where each bubble only gets limited information that fits its view?
Oh wow! So I'm so disappointed with the media that I now tell my grandkids don't believe anything you read or hear from the mainline media if it's got to do with the environment. It'll likely be wrong because the people reporting it don't know anything, or it'll be biased. And that's why then education has to be critical thinking based. And I was in Spain a year ago and giving a talk on the state of the planet from a groundwater perspective. And I had a long interview with a newspaper reporter from Madrid. And I dread those interviews, but he did his homework. He read some stuff, and it was a long interview. And what came out in the Madrid newspaper was I was actually pleased with it. Pleased in the sense that he captured what I had to say. Um, but that's rare. So where would you get anything? Well, maybe you'd have to buy Scientific America. So American or some so there's almost nowhere where we can read where the environment or anything to do with water is is readable in the state. But there are wonderful YouTube channels. So there are people who report on the environment now that are very knowledgeable. It's astounding, but you have to find them, and I think schools have to find them and bring this information to the students. The whole point, I think, of an education now is it's got to be critical thinking. It's got to be figuring out when you're reading something, is it biased? Is it wrong? who wrote it. And as you mentioned, these sound bites, like it's terribly confusing, and for young people, likely very depressing because they're all negative.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first, let me say I really love your suggestion to just read more broadly international news and not just US news, because a lot of it is very fact driven in a way that US news sometimes doesn't seem
Yeah.
to be anymore. Tell me though, we only have time for maybe two more quick questions. You mentioned feeling, I think there's a lot of folks out there who are depressed about the future of the environment, water, climate change, all of these issues that are looming. What do you say to folks who are struggling with that doomsday feeling?
Well, I'm an optimist. And so how can I possibly be an optimist? And I'm an optimist because when we look at the technologies that have been developed and are being developed, for almost everything that's ailing us in the environment, we have choices. We have choices on agriculture. We got choices on energy. We can value water more. Uh, so we have amazing choices. So people say that technology has driven humanity to this dire strait. But the technology that we even know about now can get us out of it. And so the challenges for young people is to learn enough to be a positive influencer.
I love that. You also mentioned reading just now. Your Groundwater Project is a fantastic project that's putting texts in the hands of people all over the world in different languages. Can you tell us just a little bit about that project and some of your favorite things that have come out of the project?
Well, the project got going kind of by accident, and I fell into being the leader because there's no alternative. And then it kind of got going, and we didn't know what we were doing. And now, we could publish, we'll publish our 60th book soon. We've got 40 more going, and so now we really are a global source of all things groundwater. And the books are appearing from wonderful authors from many different countries on all sorts of topics. And it's amazing. You could say, well, 60 books, isn't that enough? No, we have another 40 coming and we've got another 100 planned because groundwater and water in general is so complex. It's got so many aspects. Like how does groundwater flowing into a stream affect fish? Well, if you pump too much groundwater, the fish won't be in the stream. Or if you put this in the stream, and there's almost nothing that we value, whether it's fish or forests or anything, that doesn't have a groundwater connection. And so I'm trying to find all the articles, all the authors who understand these connections. And in some cases, there are only a few people in the world that I would say actually understand the connections because they devoted their careers to it. Now, there's a children's book called Wally and Deanna's Groundwater Adventure, and it was written in Waterloo 35 years ago by a couple of artists and a storyteller, and it's now our biggest seller. Um, and it's about aquatards, etc. So groundwater can be interesting, and if anyone wants to read a children's book, that's the one to read. And it's such a big hit that it's being translated into like 30 languages and 7 different African languages because people read this book and they become enamored with it and they say, well, can we translate it? And that's just an example.
That's super. Really briefly, because we're running out of time here, do you have one more book recommendation that you would leave us with?
Well, I discovered a YouTube channel recently, and I'll just mention it. It's called the Climate Water Project. And the guy who runs it, it's just an NGO. His name is Alpha Low, L-O. And he's a physicist, not a water person, but he's become enamored with water and enamored with groundwater. And he interviews all sorts of people. And he explains why groundwater is important to forests, why it's important to agriculture, why it's important to climate. So if I were to choose, like just going onto YouTube, he has interesting reads because it's so broad and he's not biased. That's kind of where I would start. And so he knows a lot more than I do by far about how groundwater connects to the bigger picture, even to local weather. And one of the problems that we hydrogeologists have is that when we teach groundwater, we don't know enough to teach why groundwater is important in the bigger picture. And I've been struggling with that. As you know, I give a lecture around the world, and every time I give it, I realize, oh boy, I don't know enough. Because groundwater is such a complicated little niche, and we love to talk to ourselves, and we hydrogeologists love to talking to hydrogeologists, and other people don't like to talk to us because we often are a little groundwater niche, but that interface is really interesting.
Well, John, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your love of groundwater and why it's important with not just us here today, but the whole world through the Groundwater Project. You're really the pioneer of contaminant hydrogeology, how we think about contaminants in the groundwater, and so many other important areas of groundwater hydrology. So it's an honor to have you here with us today. I want to thank the audience too. I feel like I would love to chat with you forever, John. I'm sorry we have to
Yeah.
wrap up here, but I want to thank you. And I also want to thank the audience. Thank you to our participants in Passport to Earth Day. And also, I would encourage everyone to visit the Sustainability Institute website at Ohio State to learn more and check out the future Front Porch series chats that we have coming, including there's one on energy coming up very soon, and there's also one on healthy communities. Thank you all very much for attending today.
Thank you for listening.